Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon, and I'm the preacher at the Mill Road Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And beside me is my good friend John Henry, who is the preacher at St. Leon's Church in St. Leon, Indiana. And we want to glorify God by studying from His Word and making sure that the things that we say and do glorify Him and that we're following His instructions. My friend, if you are interested in a program like this, or you have family and friends that are interested in a program like this, let them know and tell them about us. Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. is where we have this time to spend moments with the Master. If you have any questions or comments, at the end of the program, you'll be provided information where you can contact us and perhaps even visit with us and get to talk to us, because we would love that. During our worship services and also with our Bible classes each time that we assemble together. And as we, again, open up God's Word, we invite you to study with us. We're going to be going to the book of Genesis, and we have been talking about the plan of salvation, or God's plan to redeem man. And we've been looking at the history and the background there, John.
Well, I'm just going to say, yes, we are, but we're in chapter 41.
Yeah, what did I say?
You just said we're in Genesis.
Oh, yeah, Genesis chapter 41.
That's got... So yes. we want to mention what chapter we're in.
Absolutely. And,
okay.
Yeah, so we've been talking about that, and we're now at dealing with the life of Joseph. And this is where Joseph is down in Egypt, as he's been sold there by his brothers. And then there was, while he was in prison there, he comes in contact with a baker and a cupbearer, and he interprets their dreams that they had. And the cupbearer was restored, while the baker, he got hung. And Joseph said, "Remember me when these things take place." Well, the cupbearer actually forgot.
That's right.
Joseph for, and it was another 2 years. And then all of a sudden, Pharaoh has these dreams, and he wants to know, what do they mean? He's called in his magicians and so forth. They cannot interpret the dreams. And then finally, the cupbearer remembers, hey, this guy that was with us in prison, he interpreted our dreams, the baker and myself. And what he said happened as he told us. Whereas I am restored and serve you, whereas the baker had been hung. And now what we are entering into, John, in this discussion is that he is now going to send for Joseph. And so he is summoned. And what they do is they immediately come and what they do is clean Joseph up and prepare him to come before Pharaoh.
Just a moment. I
Yes.
mean, I thought that this was a really good point, because they did not allow him to go before the king unshaven,
Right.
without a bath and clean clothes.
That's right.
But, I just think that's really interesting, the respect they have for the king. And then today, I think we need to have, to some degree, respect for, God. I'm not saying that one has to wear, some, great clothing or something like that. That's not the point. The point is they cleaned him up. He was clean. He had clean clothes,
Absolutely.
It has to do with respect.
Absolutely, because later on, even when you look at the children of Israel, when God gives them the law, they were also told to clean themselves up as they would come in the presence of God for the various assemblies as well. And so you see this encouragement, this teaching of giving and showing respect to God. By the clothes, the clothing that we are properly dressed to carry out, or as to assemble with the Lord.
Yeah, I know. Not to get off track a lot,
Right,
but
yes.
I had spoken to a judge one time in his chambers, And one thing that interested me was this idea of clothing, because you hear so much about it. Somebody says, well, I don't have the proper clothing, to go to church, or I'd go. Well, okay, there really is no proper clothing, so to speak. We just, need to respect God, wear clothes that are modest and, of course, clean. But this particular judge told me, and I guess, all judges are the same. He said, if you come in before me and, you're just kind of casually dressed or something, and you have no respect for this court, he said, that's the way I look at it. He said, if something could have went, if it was questionable, could have went in your favor, it'll go the other way. And he said, that's the way I am now. He said, if you come in here and you show me respect, anything that's questionable, I'll take it your way. And so I thought that's, this, and I just thought that was interesting. Because here we've got judges today, and here you got more than a judge. You got, you got Pharaoh, you got, a king down here in Egypt. Sorry, I just wanted to
that's
throw that out there.
Those are good points that are brought up, because the scriptures tells us about these things and showing how important they were, and that they were part of the culture of that day as well. Those are some good principles to see, because we are even told about such principles even in the New Testament as well. And so it does have a bearing on what we are implying by the way that we dress.
Sure.
So when you look back at this context here, as you're pointing out, John, that he is properly prepared to go before Pharaoh here. And Pharaoh wants to know what these dreams that he's been having, what do they mean? And Pharaoh even responds to Joseph saying, I heard that you are able to interpret dreams. And then he begins to tell Joseph about this. But there was an interesting point that you had mentioned, John, there in verse 16 of chapter 41 about what Joseph's response was when Pharaoh says, you are able to interpret dreams. And it is here that you see the type of mentality that Joseph has, even experiencing the hardship and the things that he's faced in his very young life.
Yeah, again, we can compare this to other patriarchs and things, and of course later you've got Moses and different, but he didn't take the glory from himself. He didn't steal the glory away from God. He says, I might be able to interpret your dream, but he said, it's not me. I want you to know before we start, God is doing this.
That's right.
This is, totally God. He's the one that's giving you the answer, not me. So, you think about that. Here's a young man that, you can see the righteousness in him, that he's been doing everything in the fear of God, and so, he needs to be commended for what he's doing, unlike a lot of people that sometimes God will work through their life, and then, of course, God warns us about that throughout the whole Testament, that, we should never take the glory from God. If something happens, give credit where credit's due.
That's right.
It belongs to God.
Right. Because that's the whole point of what's going on here, is that God is going to be elevated in the eyes of Pharaoh and the people of Egypt. And because remember, he doesn't know, because the pharaohs were also looked upon as gods, as well as the various gods that they had and worshipped in that nation. And now here comes Joseph. He is saying, it's not me in reference to the elevation of God, but it is God himself,
right,
the true and living God. And so what that does, it's going to diminish Pharaoh as a god, and also showing the gods that they have been worshiping are nothing compared to the true and living God, who interprets and reveals and rules in the kingdom of men, as that statement is made over there in the book of Daniel with King Nebuchadnezzar. But here's that opportunity that they are given to see God at work, or the true living God in action here.
And then, of course, we go into the dream, which is very unique, about the cows that he saw. That was part of his dream in verse 18. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored, and lean flesh, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine, and they that had eaten them, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning, so I awoke. So, this is a really strange dream.
Yes.
And as we was talking a little bit before the program started, this would be, to me, hard to interpret for these magicians. And, there's a purpose for that, and we need to see that. And the purpose was, once again, God is going to be glorified, and it has to do with part of the scheme of redemption, as we've been talking about, because, of course, the meaning of these dreams is going to be, there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and then it's going to turn around. There's followed by 7 years of famine, where people are going to go hungry. But yet, Joseph, we're going to see here in the text that Joseph gives advice to Pharaoh and says, now, here's what you need to do. You need to take somebody you can trust, a smart person, and put them, in charge of this, to where, grain and stuff is stored. And what's this going to do? Well, because of this famine, it's going to bring Joseph's family down into Egypt. Absolutely. And that's God's divine providence at work here.
That's right.
As far as the scheme of redemption, because when we go back to Abraham, one of the promises God made to Abraham, your offspring is going to become what? A great nation. And so there, by God's providence, they go down there, and when they leave, what are they? Well, as we said, they're a great nation. And and then, of course, he goes on, he tells about the other dream, which has to do with the ears of corn. There were 7 thin ears of corn, and there were 7 that were, very full and good. And, of course, once again, the thin ears of corn devoured the good ones. And so, again, it pointed to this idea of plenty and famine. And so as we go down through the text here, and he explains all these things. Let's see, we can pick up with verse maybe 30. And there shall rise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. And let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And so, after of course, Joseph tells Pharaoh all this. We go into verse 37, and basically Pharaoh, as he says there, and the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And so Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And so, again, God is glorified through Joseph. I mean, can you find any greater than, him? Right. Than Joseph? I mean, he just interpreted a dream. I mean, you've got Joseph and his God, and, so he's set over, the whole thing, and he becomes second in command over the land of Egypt.
Right, absolutely. And that's the key, verse 32. As you mentioned, John, about the God, Joseph reminds Pharaoh, God is the one that has determined this, and God will bring it about quickly. And then, as you mentioned about verse 38, notice the recognition of a divine spirit or God's spirit in Joseph. And so Joseph, as you pointed out, is elevated to this position. But Joseph is representing God.
Right.
And that is what's so important about striving to live right and do right according to what God has revealed in His Word, because God's character is at play here. And that's what the Apostle Paul had mentioned to the brethren at Ephesus, that they needed to conduct themselves in a holy manner, because what they had learned from Christ was how to live. And for us to live ungodly but yet claim to be a part of Christ really brings a disservice and a disgrace to the name. And God will not tolerate His name being disgraced like that. But here you see Joseph representing God the way and that pleases God. And another thing about this, John, as you were talking about the God bringing about this in preserving fulfilling the promise that He made to Abraham. And though Joseph waited in prison for 2 more years, wanting to get out, that tells us that no matter who we are, no matter what we go through, it's about God's timetable.
Right.
God is the one that's in control. God has determined that, and that goes back to verse 32. And so Joseph having to endure prison for another 2 years, remember, Joseph is on God's timetable and still have the mentality to express what he expressed there in verse 32 to Pharaoh. And he is to be commended for having that. And it becomes a good example for us. We want to hurry things up.
We want to hurry God up.
And we want to hurry God up.
And you don't do that.
That's exactly right.
You got to wait on God.
Absolutely. And it will all work out when we put our trust in Him and follow what He says. And that's really a tremendous lesson that we learn over and over again from the book of Genesis, because you see where man messed up when we follow our own devised plans. But we see things work out when we follow what God says.
Another thing that's when we go down, we can move on down to verse 41 and 42. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. Now, look at verse 42. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And so, again, I mean, think about this. Here is a king. I mean, you just took a prisoner out of that, yes. And all of a sudden you're taking your signet ring off and you're putting it on his hand.
Right.
And with that ring, remember, that was the seal that was the official seal.
Absolutely.
Joseph's wearing that now.
Absolutely.
Man, you know, that really is a credit to Joseph. Well, not just Joseph, but we should say to God.
Absolutely.
Because God is behind this all.
Yes, right.
So
You know, it's interesting that it made me think of a lesson in this, and the lesson could be from the gutter to glory.
yeah,
In the sense of, you know,
Yeah.
where Joseph is, and it's all because he followed God.
right.
And now it is by the providence and work of God he has been raised from prison to the palace of the king. And so that really says a lot about what happens when we follow the Lord.
Yeah, we might have adverse circumstances come our way, but we need to be like Joseph. We need to be able to hold out, like we said a moment ago, and wait on God.
Right.
Sometimes we want to get maybe discouraged, and like we said a moment ago, we want to hurry God along, and we begin to say, well, where is God? Well, where is God? Why isn't He doing something? Well, it's like we said. We need to realize God works, as you said a moment ago, on His own timetable.
That's right.
He doesn't work according to our timetable.
Right.
He works according to His.
That's right.
We live in such a fast society.
Yes.
It's like, God has become like, like people expect when they drive through McDonald's or something to get a meal. They think that they can just, pray up to God, and all of a sudden, okay, there it is. But
Right.
God is not like that. And people say, well, how long will it be for God, will do this, that? Well, nobody knows.
Right.
And that's another thing that's taught in the Old Testament, I think, in the Psalms, in Proverbs, and there's passages in there that teach us to wait on God. Don't get ahead of God.
That's right.
That's not a good thing.
That's right.
Because He'll let you go. You go ahead. You keep on going.
That's right. And when it even comes to with the gospel message, the gospel message is God has given the plan for people to obey in order to rise from the muck and mire of sin, to rise and be seated with Christ. And that's what the book of Ephesians talks about there in Ephesians chapters 1 and 2. Because of the grace of God, we have been raised up together with Him. Here we were in our transgressions, in our sins. We were imprisoned by it. But because of what God has done and our obedience to God's way, we end up rising and to be seated with Him. And that's by His grace. Even here, we're seeing God's grace with Joseph. Joseph didn't deserve this. Even though Joseph did a lot of good things and behaved himself properly, it's not that Joseph deserved this. This is about God's grace at work in the life of Joseph to bring about the will that He has put in place.
Good point. And I think a lot of times that's hard for us as human beings to understand. Just like Paul, he had that thorn in the flesh, and he kept praying, and God would say, my grace is sufficient.
That's right.
Well, look at what Joseph went through. But yet, it might not say here, but I think we can see that if we knew the prayers of Joseph in the response, we would hear God, now Joseph, my grace is sufficient.
Absolutely, yes.
And that is really, and sometimes even for me, it's sometimes it's a challenge. It's hard to get a hold of. That's
right.
And that's why it's important to study the Bible like we're doing, to understand God.
That's right.
And understand what grace is all about. We're going to have to go through things. We're going to have to endure things, just like Christ did. Look at everything that He endured. Why did He do that? He did it for us.
That's right.
Well, there are things in God's divine providence that are going to have to work out over time. And we're going to see this in the Old Testament. And so, like you said, Joseph really didn't deserve all the things that he went through, but it was because of God's grace. And he evidently had some kind of understanding of that as a young man, because because of this famine, his brothers are going to come down into Egypt.
That's right. Yes.
And they're afraid there at the end when they find out, because they said, "Oh, we're afraid you could kill us," and he could have took vengeance on them,
sure
and and no questions asked. They could have all been put to death. But he said, "Hey," at that point, he began to tell them, "Hey, this was this God's hand was in all this. God meant this to be. This was part of God's grace."
That's right. Because one of the key phrases that you see, even as I mentioned with Joseph, that God showed his kindness to Joseph. God was with Joseph. And you see that all throughout the reading of the life of Joseph. And that goes along with the whole aspect of what grace is concerning God, God's kindness. And the things that Joseph went through, that wasn't pleasant. I'm sure it wasn't pleasant of what he went through. But yet God is with him, showing that's what grace does. Grace sustains us through it all, while we're facing it, as long as we're trusting and following God's way. It'll sustain us through whatever difficulties come our way. And then as we wait on God's timetable, then we can see his glory and give him the praise that he deserves for it. John, getting back to these things that we're seeing, and here Joseph has been raised to this position with Pharaoh, next to Pharaoh, really, when you start to look at this. And verse 46 of 41 tells us Joseph is now 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. That's a long time. If you really think about, we look at it probably about 17, maybe 16, 17 years old. And now here he is 30 years old. And now rose to this position. So you got you got a decade or so here where these things have taken place.
Yeah.
Sometimes good things take time. And we get frustrated when it doesn't happen now. We have to be patient. We have to wait on God. Because when God does it, it's going to be right. It's going to be proper. It's going to be that which will it's not some kind of fluke thing. It's real. And so when you're looking at this aspect with Joseph, and notice his character continues to flourish because he has waited on God, and God has elevated him to this position with Pharaoh.
Well, like you're saying, Pharaoh thought so much of him, that in verse 45 it says that, he found him a wife, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So I take it that was set up and arranged by Pharaoh himself.
Right.
But I just thought that was interesting. He thought of him, that much that here you have a priest, probably one of the Egyptian priests, I would say. Yeah. And then, so anyway, that's interesting too, how the providence of God worked in him, receiving a wife.
Right.
So.
And then you have his family, Joseph's family, growing as he has his firstborn two sons, Manasseh, and then Ephraim. The second one is verses 51 and 52 tells us. And so again, when these years of plenty are going by, they are making preparations for the years of the famine that will come about. And because of this, the land is spared. And it's interesting that that kind of wisdom that God conveyed through Joseph spares the land. It didn't spare it from the hardship that it would go through.
Right.
But the provisions were made for them to make it through, as well as fulfilling God's overall plan, and that is the descendants of Abraham, the seed of Abraham, in which eventually would point to and end up being fulfilled in the Christ.
And then as we come down here to towards the end of the chapter, verse 55, the land of the time of plenty is over. Now we're going to go to the famine, and the people, become hungry.
Right.
And they go to Pharaoh, but what does Pharaoh do? No, wait a minute, don't. You go see Joseph.
Yes.
you let Joseph take care of you.
That's right.
And that's interesting. Again, the providence of God at work.
Absolutely.
You go see Joseph because Pharaoh, had already acknowledged Joseph's God as the God.
That's right.
And now the people are going to have to deal with Joseph and his God.
Awesome.
Yes, it is.
And John, our time is up, and we want to extend our appreciation to all of you for tuning in and spending time with us in Moments with the Master. And we invite you to come back next Thursday evening at 7 p.m. and join us again when we will spend a few moments with the Master. But in the meantime, my friend, may God bless you in your studies of His Word.